Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 17, Section 2, JFK and the Cold War. So as we begin, make sure you have your packet handy. Roman numeral 1, containing communism. President Kennedy wanted to renew his diplomatic focus in Latin America during the start of his presidency. And some of this is because of some events that were going on in the Western Hemisphere. The fact that leading up until the 1960 election, we had a revolution that took place in Cuba and kind of had the beginnings of kind of a Red Scare in the Caribbean with uh, Cuba kind of siding with the Soviet Union. Certainly, there was some concerns about what was happening in that part of the world, and that the United States needed to have maybe a better relationship with Latin America to prevent the spread of communism. Letter B, the Peace Corps was one of those organizations that was helpful as far as establishing good relationships with Latin America, but it was an organization that sent young Americans to perform humanitarian service in less developed nations. Uh, Young people, probably in their 20s, who had backgrounds in medicine, education, agriculture, engineering, volunteered to go overseas. And most of the time, when they volunteered for a 2 year tour. And what would happen is, while they were gone, they would live with the people, learn the culture, and also try to uh, show or teach some of the skills that they had learned. So if it was understanding better medicine, maybe uh, teaching about better hygiene and bacterial controls of like water systems, just to name a few things. And letter C, in 1961, President Kennedy responded to the Soviet successes in space by going before Congress and stating his goal to land a man on the moon. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, had actually been put into orbit. And that was a concern to the United States because the Soviets had had several successes and were kind of jumping ahead of the United States in the space race. Within 6 weeks of Gagarin's launch, Kennedy had asked Congress to consider putting money forth to fund the moonshot. And eventually, you're going to see some different things happening. By 1962, the United States had put a man into orbit, and that was John Glenn. Um, by the time we get to the mid 1960s, we had already started the second phase of our space program with Project Gemini. And by July of 1969, we had actually made it to the moon with our crew of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Roman numeral 2, crisis of the Cold War. Kennedy faced several crises when you talk about his administration. The first crisis occurred in the country of Cuba. And really, the ball was rolling on this really even before um, Kennedy came into office. Letter B, President Eisenhower had feared that Cuba would become a base for communists to spread revolution throughout the Western Hemisphere. And so, with help with the CIA, uh, there was a plan to kind of help teach Cuban nationalists who were living in exile basically some skills that they could go in and they could actually try to overthrow the Castro government. And a plan was made for this attack. Well, Eisenhower left office. And so the plan was still on the books by the time JFK came into office. And it actually took place in the spring of 1961 on April 17th, 1961. So, letter C, as a result of this fear, Eisenhower trained and armed Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. And there were roughly 1,400 exiles that would land that day on April 17th, 1961. The purpose of this mission was to touch off a popular uprising against the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Castro, when he came to power in 1959, he quickly turned to Nikita Khrushchev to ask for support, and that was the birth of this relationship, and communist Cuba kind of comes out of that. So let's talk about the day of the invasion here. Um, the invasion takes place. Uh, Eisenhower and the CIA had planned that these exiles would have air support from the United States Air Force and naval support from the U.S. Navy. But Kennedy was afraid that by having our armed forces involved in this, that we might provoke an attack by the Soviet Union. So he withdrew that support. And as a result, our 1,400 Cuban exiles, they land on the beach and are quickly apprehended. Along with that, troops that were supposed to land on the beach, some of them became high centered out in the areas outside of uh, the landing zone because of coral reefs, and eventually were again captured. So it was a complete disaster. What's interesting is Kennedy does go on television days after this event and apologizes to the American people for this blunder. Also in 1969, our friends, the Soviets, began the construction of the Berlin Wall. Part of this was because of the fact that Nikita Khrushchev, wanted to stop the flow of East Germans into West Berlin. And many of them were crossing makeshift barriers and easily getting into the West. And as a result, Castro was a little, or not Castro, but Khrushchev was a little jealous. Khrushchev also wanted the United States, Great Britain, and France to withdraw from West Berlin and to allow uh, Berlin to be unified as a communist capital. And Kennedy refused. And as a result of that, Khrushchev retaliates by building this wall, this barrier, which is going to stand until basically then the beginning of 1990. This barrier really is a symbolic symbol of the Iron Curtain, built out of concrete and steel. There would be many escaped attempts across this barrier in the 30 some years that it stood. Roman numeral E. The Bay of Pig invasion, as I mentioned before, was a failure because it made our country look weak and disorganized. In letter F, in 1962, we have the beginnings of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This basically was resolved when President Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba and privately agreed to remove missiles from the country of Turkey if the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba. And to kind of make a long story short, um, we have the building of the wall, we had the failed Bay of Pigs, and so Khrushchev starts sending um, basically the components to build missile sites on the island of Cuba. And the goal would be to kind of shorten the range of a nuclear attack from roughly 30 minutes to maybe just within minutes. And by putting up these missile sites in Cuba, that would certainly give Khrushchev a brutal blow to the United States if we'd ever go towards a nuclear war. So, anyway, U-2 spy planes had been flying missions over Cuba. They had taken pictures of these installation sites, and eventually the CIA informs the president that um, the Cubans are, for the most part, building these missiles and or building the sites. And so we set up a barricade, a blockade around the island of Cuba. And you can kind of see that maybe on the map here. And the goal was to keep Soviet ships from coming into Cuba. And what we have in October of 1962 is a stalemate. Soviet versus the United States, nose to nose, really right on the brink of war. And what we're doing is waiting to see who's going to blink first. And what ends up happening is the Soviets back off. And eventually we negotiate, and part of what we're going to agree to do is to remove similar missile sites in Turkey. And part of that was to, kind of a goodwill gesture. But we also open up communication between Moscow and Washington, D.C. by establishing actually a phone line between the two capitals. Roman numeral 3, the death of the president. Letter A, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy had traveled to Texas for a couple of reasons. One, he was visiting Houston and seeing some of the progress on the Apollo project. But he was also in the process of preparing for the 1964 presidential election. And Texas, for the most part, had a lot of Democrats. Matter of fact, President Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was from Texas and was accompanying him on this trip. And so he went to Texas that day. Along with him came Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy, just kind of on a side note, she was recovering from the loss of their son, Patrick. When the Kennedys entered the White House, they had a young daughter, Caroline. Before Kennedy was inaugurated, they had a son, John. And during his presidency, they had another child named Patrick. But Patrick was born with a birth defect and died within hours after being born. And both were grief stricken. And so to kind of, lift her spirits, President Kennedy had asked if she would go along to Dallas and accompany him on this trip, and she agreed to it. Unfortunately, it has a very dark ending. And so, as the president and his wife, and then in the seat just in front of the president and his wife, the governor of Texas and his wife are traveling in this motorcade, bullets ring out, and President Kennedy is shot first in the throat. There's actually a bullet that is fired, and it not only does it hit him, but it actually passes first through the governor of Texas and then through President Kennedy. And then within seconds, another shot is fired, hitting the president in the head. So Kennedy passes away in Dallas. President Johnson is sworn in as President of the United States, and quickly they fly President Kennedy's body, the First Lady, and the new president back to D.C. As a result of all this, there was a lot of concern that maybe there had been a bigger conspiracy, and thus a lot of people wanted some investigation. Hence, in letter B, we're going to form what is known as the Warren Commission. And after careful examination, the Warren Commission determined that President Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald worked for the Texas Book Depository, which was a big warehouse of school textbooks, and it was believed that he alone fired the shots that day that killed the president. There's a lot that we don't know as far as motive around Lee Harvey Oswald, because within days of being apprehended, he was brought before, or was going to be brought before, a judge for a hearing. And as he is traveling from his holding cell to the courtroom, a man named Jack Ruby steps out and shoots and assassinates Oswald. And so that's led a lot of people to wonder if this was some kind of CIA event, or if Oswald had been involved with the KGB, which is kind of like the Soviet equivalent of the CIA. Just so you know, Lee Harvey Oswald had spent a few years in the Soviet Union. So all of this has led to a lot of mystique and mystery. Letter C. After Kennedy's death, President Lyndon B. Johnson set out to promote many of the programs that Kennedy had left unfinished. And one of the things that Johnson was able to sign into law shortly after Kennedy's assassination was a sweeping civil rights reform. And eventually that's going to get some notoriety that we will talk about later. Thank you very much.